Hello and welcome back to the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. My name is Clay Wright, and I'm joined here by the one, the only, Charlie Miller.
Pastor Charlie Miller in the house.
Pastor Charlie, how you doing?
Doing well. Better than I deserve.
That's right.
That's right.
Every time someone says that, I'm like, I feel not as good about myself because I don't say that.
I'm trying to say it more often. Call me old school, but
that's like people who say I'm blessed.
I'm blessed.
Joe Gonzalez, though, he has the best, how are you doing substitute, which is, do you know what it is? What's good?
What's good?
What's good?
What's good?
It's so positive, but anyhow.
What's good?
So this past week, we had an opportunity to preach out of Luke 7, and Pastor Jason and Pastor John Jacobs also preached at each of our campuses. We had a preacher there in person this past week, which are some really fun weeks to see how the text gets unpacked. If you're curious to see the differences in the sermons, they're all available on our YouTube channel, so you can go and check those out. But for now, we are the representatives.
Yeah, you
here.
get us. Sorry, guys.
So,
but hey, we'll speak for them.
That's right. That's right.
Just kidding.
With Jason, he told me from our Lorraine campus, he was like, "Make sure you mention pickleball for me." Did you hear Jason's sermon?
I didn't.
Okay, then that won't make any sense to you. But
I saw the beginning of it with the pickleball, like the ping pong.
Yeah.
And the pickleball. Yeah.
That was his orienting illustration, which was really cool. But love you, Jason. There's your shout out.
Yeah.
So
I promise I'll listen to your sermon. I just haven't yet. Sorry, I'm a bad student.
But the first thing I want to just remind us is of where we've been. This is actually the second to last week that we're in this series about people meeting Jesus, which it's been so cool to see. This is one thing that, although I love reading Paul and I love anytime we can get into the Old Testament, into some narrative, the narratives where Jesus is there in the flesh are so significant because we get to see these poignant interactions. And so this is the second to last week where we were watching Simon the Pharisee and him meeting Jesus. Next week, Pastor Jim is going to be unpacking this similar text, same text, about the sinful woman meeting Jesus. So I'm excited for that as well. But there's plenty on the cutting room floor because there's all these rich cultural details. Yeah. And then as we'll see, you and I took a similar understanding of the text, of that interaction with Simon. So to start, why don't we read the text, and then why don't you, maybe you can go first and just kind of give us a little taste of kind of where you were at in the text, where the Lord was leading you, and then I'll go and we'll get into it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Do you have the Bible?
Yeah, I hid my Bible right there.
I've hidden it in my heart.
Do you have the whole passage memorized?
I've hidden God's word in my heart.
Did you read the whole passage start to finish?
I didn't.
No, okay. I did.
Wow.
It was awesome, but
I only read the first few verses.
It was I made a really big deal about it. I was like, I thought about breaking it up, but this is advice I got one time from a preacher. He said, the most powerful words you'll speak in a sermon are when you're reading and quoting scripture. And I've always taken that to heart. And so I've shared that statement with the Illyria congregation. Yeah. Because this is God's word. And so it's awesome to get to unpack it together. But I'll read it just because then we can reference back to it. So starting in Luke 7:36, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house, reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. So there you get sort of the inciting incident, the setting, and then you get the action. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus in saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of them both. Now, which one will love him more? And Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. And then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Nice mic drop. That's actually not the end of the story, though.
It's not.
Some people have this story going through chapter 8, verse 2. I don't know if you saw that at all, but because in chapter 8, verse 2, it talks about some of the women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, and they connect that back.
Interesting.
I don't necessarily see them as connected directly, but there's 3 more verses because it goes all the way to verse 50. But Pastor Jim will get into that this Sunday. In the meantime, share with us where were you at in the text?
Yeah,
what were some of the things that stuck out to you?
We were focusing on Simon, which it'll be interesting to see. I think it's a cool approach to look at both characters and use that kind of as our launching point as we dig in. But there's some compare and contrast, obviously, in the text between these two characters. First of all, the one thing I'll say about the sinful woman, which I know we're not going to talk about her much, but one thing I said is, could you imagine if that was your title?
Yes. Oh, dude. I remember you saying that in your sermon. That was so funny.
Imagine it's like, all right, like you make your debut. Guess what? You made it in the Word. It's like, take a look, and you read. You're like, all right, sinful woman. Oh, okay,
great.
That's my name. Slap it on a name tag. I'm the sinful life woman.
The other thing you said around that point in your sermon was you were like, if I was sitting down in a restaurant eating and someone came, do you want to say it?
Yeah. I said, some of the cultural things are lost. I said, by the way, if I'm sitting in a restaurant eating with my family or dialoguing with a Pharisee, whoever, please don't come and wash my feet. I appreciate the heart behind it, but
that was so funny.
It's definitely not how you could best serve me. Obviously in that context, which is why it's important to understand that it was less about the act itself, because washing feet, perfume, those were things that were normal in that culture.
Right.
Well, what the main issue was the state of this woman and how the Pharisee felt about her.
Right.
It was less about like, I can't believe, whereas today it'd be like, what in the world is she doing to his feet? What in the world is he doing with the perfume? And, that's because it's cultural. The cultural difference is important to understand. But
yeah.
So I was focusing on my kind of realization was that this man had so much pride, and that was what was driving. I know that's what you were talking about too. That's what was driving his actions and his judgmental thoughts. And so Jesus is kind of calling out the pride that's within him. And so that's kind of I was talking because that last phrase that Jesus says when he confronts him is, and we'll dig into this more later, but forgiven, those who have been forgiven little, love little. And so the flip side is, if you've been forgiven much, your natural tendency is to love much. Modeled by the woman, but specifically it applies to us that, like, in other words, when we allow pride to be in our heart, pride limits our capacity to love.
Yeah. I used almost the same phrases.
Yeah.
I stole them from you because
I love it.
Because
we talked. Yeah.
Anyway, keep going.
Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Well, I was just gonna say I had one main idea at the end, but I had an application point in the middle, and the application point was pride produces a self-centered perspective that limits your capacity to love or limits your ability to love.
Yeah, and I think that's the point is the capacity.
Yes.
I think that's what Jesus is getting at, is that, like, as Christians, it applies to us. When we look at our lives, if you were to pan out, if you were to step back in the third person and be watching your life, if you were to see places where a person struggles to love, it's because they've allowed pride to grow in their heart.
Yeah.
And so I was even thinking about, like, there are stories that are a little too personal to share in a sermon because they impact people in my life in today's context.
That's why there's the cutting room floor, though.
That's right.
I'm joking. I was
it'd be funny if I could just say their names, and every time I say their name, you just beep, 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 beep. Like,
or we'll just
blurt it out.
Clip you saying the sinful woman and put that in over their names. Hey, I talked about you on the podcast.
That's hilarious. That's so good. But I have people close to me in my life, friends, family, those things, who, you know, my tendency might be to judge them and their life choices or what I see, you know, happening. And it's interesting because it's moved beyond I disagree and I would do things differently, and it's moved into I just struggle to love them. Like I struggle to be around them. I just don't want to. I don't want to be associated with them. I don't want to be around them. Whatever it is. Yeah. And people in the church, people like we all struggle with that, right? And whenever we feel that well up within us, like I'm not going to associate with them anymore, or I struggle, I'm facing a barrier in my life. I'm running into some kind of a wall when it comes to love. That's pride. It's pride. I'm thinking myself too highly.
Yes.
And
remind me of your opening illustration was electric vehicles.
Yeah. The limiting factor. So like that's one thing I talked about too. That's kind of my take home. My main point was, you know, pride limits your capacity to love, or another way of saying that is pride is the limiting factor for love.
Yes.
Like we all have a limiting factor in life. And so that you know, illustration of the Tesla was like, but in general, this idea of like, pride limits love. Right. And for the non-believer, pride is everything. Like it's all about pride. The pride of life is the staple of their life. I mean, they don't have a God that they worship. And so naturally their ability to truly love is limited. But for the Christian, it's when we allow that slow fade of pride to come back in that we, it's revealed. That's another thing too, is like the great revealer of pride in our lives is when love is lost or love is becomes a grind. Yeah. And when you see people struggling to love, or when you're struggling to love, often that is the revealer. It reveals the hidden pride in your heart. Yeah. That sometimes you don't even know is there. And you're like, oh my word, Lord, forgive me for this pride I've allowed to grow up in my heart that I didn't know was there. Because it comes out as the symptom of, I can't love. Like you feel this love resistance. It's like, why am I struggling to love this person? You've allowed pride to seep in.
It's so interesting.
I keep burping. I'm sorry.
I know, dude. Yeah, this podcast is not sponsored by Gatorade.
Mine's a
whatever this
fast
is.
Switch.
But we've had a long day.
We have. It's been a long day.
So we're very caffeinated, which is good. But I was gonna say, and you're going to have to help me remember this quote. I think it's Steve Ettner, because I think it was recently for those of you who don't know Steve Ettner, he's nationally known, internationally known.
Yeah, really, yeah.
Speaker on, for men on purity, these sorts of things. And I met him recently through the No Man Walks Alone event. Yeah. Charlie, you knew him before that, which is super cool.
Yeah, he's a godly
man. He was talking about pride at No Man Walks Alone, and he mentioned how easy it is to get people to, comparatively speaking, to admit that they struggle with other sins, but pride is the hardest thing to get people to see in themselves.
That's right.
It's like, he's like, because he works with men who struggle with pornography addictions,
and affairs, and
he's like, I'll get
sexual addictions.
Like he said something to the effect of, it's easier to get a man to confess to me an affair than to admit that he struggles with pride.
It's just
which is nuts.
It's nuts, but it's so true.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because to confess it, the first step is to confess it, which means you're identifying that the way you live your life at its core is broken.
And what's interesting, as I reflected more on this, because we don't talk about pride a ton at Open Door, but one thing that's a huge theme of Pastor Jim's preaching and of the way that he talks about sin is that he talks about it in terms of self-centeredness, which is pride. That self-centering impulse, that's pride. Yeah. And this is why some people talk about pride as the root of all other kinds of sin. In the same way that Pastor Jim might talk about, and I guess he can, Pastor Jim, feel free to clarify this sometime.
In the comment
but he'll talk about how sin is this self-centeredness. It's this self-promoting, self-focused, behavior that's damaging to people. It's an offense to God.
Yeah.
And that self-centeredness is me putting myself on the throne of my heart, me living for myself, me treating myself like I'm God. And I didn't go there, but you could go back into the garden and identify pride as the root of the fall, both in Satan and in Adam and Eve. You know,
you're right.
And the tragic thing is Adam and Eve fall prey to the temptation to be like God, when in reality, God's plan was always for them to image him.
That's right.
It was just to do it according to his plan in partnership with him, rather than stepping out of the bounds of his commands.
Right. You're right.
It's just like, anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But
and you know, one thing I kind of was thinking through, and I mentioned it in my message, but thinking through the love God, love people, live surrendered. You can't live surrendered if you allow pride. Pride and surrender can't go hand in hand. So even in that phrase that we is such a heartbeat of our church.
Yes,
you literally can't live surrendered without stripping away pride.
Oh yeah.
And anytime you've allowed pride to come back in, because naturally, as I was working through this and thinking about it, our natural bent is pride, self-preservation, seeking pleasure, fleeing pain, all these things that are built into us as humans on one level, and then sinful humans on another. If left to ourselves, our flesh will naturally go back to pride.
Yeah.
It's like a slow fade. And there's so many analogies you can make in life. I mean, like there's so many things in our life that are a slow fade, that if you don't make the conscious step to move forward in something, it's like getting out of shape. Like you will if you don't work out, you will slowly, gradually get less and less in shape. Right? Naturally, your body is not going to maintain a muscle chiseled physique, unless you are taking that active step to maintain your body in that way. Naturally, the natural bent, I'm not saying even if you don't gain weight, your natural bent is to lose. If you're not using that muscle, you're going to naturally lose it, and you're going to naturally
atrophy and
all those things. It's the same way. Our natural bent is to be prideful, and so left to our own vices, left to our own selves, we will naturally fade gradually back into a life of pride. If we're not staying sharp with the Spirit's work in our life, if we're not staying on top of it and stripping away pride, confessing sin, leaning into what God wants to do in our life, pressing into the redemption that's at work in our heart constantly.
I'm just laughing because it's like, absolutely. Like I'm slow to pray because I think I have it under control. Yeah. That's pride. I'm slow to confess because it doesn't feel good. I don't want to admit that I'm wrong. That's pride. Yeah. I seek out selfish pleasures because I want to feel good. Pride. Like you could go down the list of like,
and then think about the times when you are like usually firing all cylinders spiritually. It's because when the prideful things you pursue fall short, and your bottom cape falls out, and you've hit kind of rock bottom in some way, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I need to be in the Word more.
Yeah, you're reminded of your dependence.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you're in the Word. You can't get enough of the Word. You can't pray enough, and you're just like, oh, you're confessing to everyone around you, and you're seeking accountability, and you're in this raw moment because you're like, I'm broken. I'm sorry. I've sinned, and you're confessing those things, and you're just digging in because what you've realized is that your pride, in a nutshell, what you're realizing is that your pride didn't actually scratch the itch. It actually made things worse. And was hurting you and people around you. And so now you're at that spot. But then when things are going good in life, when sin is staying secret, when all these things, like pride just grows and festers under the surface. And maybe you don't even notice it underneath. Like it's under the surface. You don't even notice it on top. Yeah. And then all of a sudden when it's revealed, again, it's that cycle again, because then we're back to, I'm in the Word. I'm nothing. And thank you, Lord, for giving me purpose. And and it's like, why can't we just stay there all the time? Right? Yeah. And that's the wrestle. But I want to hear more about, like, you've kind of taken, you took the similar approach as we were talking about the pride, but kind of add some of your perspective to it, like your flavor. Perspective.
That's a good phrase. That was the word that I used.
Yeah, I remember that.
Set my whole sermon up
because of the different perspective that were had in that story, and that's kind of your vantage point. I remember that.
I struggled a lot with the text this week. Some sermons feel like they come together easily. So none of them are like easy, but some of them are easier by comparison. And always when we preach, we're asking the question, all right, Lord, what is the point of the text? What is the point that you're communicating to your people through your word?
Yeah.
And how can I embody that? How can I apply that? How can I bring people along the journey that you brought me on to see that point? And that's where a lot of the passion in preaching comes out, is you're like, man, I've met with God, I've prayed, and now I want to bring you along that journey so that you can see the point of this text too and be impacted by it and apply it to your life. So, and what's interesting, we talked about how we're splitting this text up over 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so that means we're going to be preaching 2 sermons about the same text, and you can't preach the same sermon twice. So even though each text has one main point, there's many applications, and there's lots of, in his book on preaching, Tim Keller calls this, there's high roads in the text and there's by roads in the text. And the idea is all roads lead to, according to Tim Keller, Christ and the gospel. And so you want to preach the gospel in each text, but sometimes you can do that through the high road. Sometimes you do that through the by road.
That's right.
So in some ways, this text is about, if you go up and you look up a sermon on Luke 7:36 through 50, most people will compare and contrast Simon the Pharisee with the sinful woman, and they'll say, Simon failed to recognize his sin and worship Jesus, and so don't be like Simon. The woman recognized her sin and worshiped Jesus. Be like the woman. Yeah. And so they compare and contrast, and that's kind of I would agree. I think that's kind of the point of the text, is that Simon is
Jesus
a negative example.
Jesus does it. He actually compares and contrasts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the natural breakdown of the text. But because there's so much going on culturally and all these other details, that's why it's helpful to break it. Actually, I had my manuscript, when I finished writing it, was like 6,500 words, which is a long sermon.
I'm not surprised.
I cut it down to like 4,500 words, which is still a long. I cut it down to.
I've never counted my words. I should go back and count my words just to get a sense.
The Logos Bible Software Sermon Builder. For any of you,
do you use that?
Oh yeah, dude.
That's where you build your sermon
every week.
Really?
Oh yeah. It starts out as a note on my phone. So like right now, I've got next time I'm preaching is Mother's Day.
Is it all saved on Logos?
Oh yeah.
I don't even know how to use it, dude. I've never used that.
It's amazing.
Because I only ever use Google Docs, dude.
It's especially nice for me because since I use an iPad when I'm preaching.
I do too, so it would be nice for me.
Oh yeah. It's the presentation of the notes on the iPad through the Logos app is immaculate. But
you heard it here first, folks.
If anybody is a preacher out there, Logos Sermon Builder. You can do your slides in there. I don't, but you could. You could design your handout in there just by highlighting things. It's pretty. I'll show it to you. I'm gonna change your life, Charlie. But no,
we'll now take a break from this podcast.
Charlie come back. He'll just be glowing.
Just come back. All right, we're back.
Oh man!
Wow, that was amazing, Clay. Thank you for sharing me that. No, I'm just kidding.
Actually,
that's awesome.
We had to do that recently when Jim and I were recording the podcast. We had to pause the podcast because I can say now, because there won't be a spoiler, but we were writing the song for Easter Sunday, and the worship guys came in and they were like, "We finished the song, but we all we got stuff to do." So we paused the podcast. We went in, gave final feedback on the song, and then came back and finished the podcast. It was awesome.
That's awesome.
So anyhow, breaking down the text like that, focusing on Simon the Pharisee, it was a tough sermon to write, but I was so glad that I spent the time struggling with it, because I began to see how Jesus and Simon had different perspectives on what was going on with the woman. And so, what I did in the sermon, I set it up by talking about how your perspective is determined by what you see, what the thing that you're focused on. And I talked my opening illustration. Have you ever seen the picture of like the rabbit and the young woman that also looks like a duck and an old woman? You know what I'm talking about? Like sometimes in psychology classes or in high school, they'll show these things. So I put those up, and I asked people to, get an impression of what you're looking at. And then I had people raise their hands who saw the rabbit.
It's kind of like the dress. Is the dress blue or gold?
Dude, I brought that up in life group. People were fighting for like a half hour.
Oh, it's that still, but I've been able to see it one time. I was able to see both, but we'll get into it another time.
So it's funny you said, the reason I was going to use the dress originally, for those of you who weren't around in 2015,
look it up.
Look up the dress,
Yeah,
black, blue, white, gold. I promise
If they
it'll pop
weren't
up. There's a
around-
Wikipedia article on it.
How many 9-year-olds are listening to this podcast? You're like, if you're not around in 2015, if you're 9, and you haven't been
Yeah. If you weren't on the internet in 2015,
Okay.
but it's the reason I didn't use it is because I found a picture of it and I was like, oh, clearly they edited this to look white and gold. I pulled up that picture at Life Group and they were like, what do you mean it's white and gold? It's black. And it started a whole.
Yeah, that's what I'm
it
saying.
started a whole thing.
Yeah, one time I pulled it up, it was definitely gold. Another time I pulled it up, it was definitely blue.
Yeah, but
nuts.
the point is, like, our brains are designed. We're designed as humans. We're meaning-making creatures. That's not to say we have authority on reality, but that's to say that whatever we're focused on, we have this self-confirming bias that wants to make everything else fit in around that. And so in the sermon, I unpacked, what is Simon focusing on that is making meaning out of the rest of the situation?
That's right.
What is Jesus looking at that's making meaning out of the rest of the situation? Because that changes your impression of what's going on. And so for Simon, I unpacked how, through looking at some cultural details and looking into the specific language of the text and his response to the woman, basically he's focused on himself. All he's concerned about is his own ritual purity. He's concerned about the danger that this woman poses to him. He's concerned about his opinion of Jesus and his ability to look down on and cast judgment on Jesus. So he's got this self-centered perspective. So it's the perspective of pride. And
I also think that in some ways this is early enough in Jesus' ministry that I have to wonder if there was part of him too that was like, maybe there's a chance. Like maybe this is some kind of a test. Maybe there's a chance that he'll actually, you have to wonder early enough that maybe there's a chance that surely this guy's going to condemn this woman. Surely. Right.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So like, even then he was like, it was like this confirmation bias, but almost like, I love that. Like he had this perspective of like, but maybe, like, surely if he's this, so it was like he was wrestling with like who Jesus is for himself. Yeah. And it was like, oh, well, never mind. You're like, okay.
And then by contrast, Jesus is gracious. So Jesus, he sees Simon's heart because there's this, Simon's talking to himself and then Jesus answers him, which is hilarious that Luke includes that detail. Jesus is, that. Do you take the view, because not everybody takes that as Jesus being like looking into his heart by omniscience. Some people take the view that Jesus is just reading it on Simon's face. Do you have an impression about that? I know I'm totally springing this on you in the middle of me talking about.
I take the omniscience view.
I do too.
Because there are other times where it says knowing what they said in their heart, Jesus says blank and it fills in. So like in my mind,
yeah.
I think in my mind, okay, this ties into the kenosis and like the Spirit's role.
That's exactly where I was about to go.
And like how I feel like it feels like a controller. Yeah. That like there are times that the Spirit really limits Jesus access to his own power, and there are times the Spirit, I think, gives Jesus more access to his power. Part of that was his surrender to the Spirit. Like at his baptism, his surrender to the Spirit's guiding work in his life, and he modeled that for us. And so now we're going all the way back to Luke 2 when we preach that. Luke 4, I guess, not 2. Luke 2 is his birth, but Luke 4.
Right.
It's like a gauge. And so I think there are some times when we see this all of a sudden where it's like Jesus has access to more of his deity. Like it's weird because he never loses a deity, but he willingly limits himself.
Yeah, like for example, I don't think that Jesus was always omniscient on earth.
I agree.
For example, he says, even the Son of Man doesn't know the time or the day of certain things about the end times. So,
correct. But then he says, "I will see you in paradise," right? To the guy on the cross. So I think again there are times, and we don't understand fully how that works, but our best guess is that it was like for different purposes. So then, of course, that was part of his humbling. Now that he's fully in glory, has full access to the omniscience of God. Yeah,
and for those who aren't familiar with the term, when you talk about kenosis, is that's the Greek word for emptying or something like that?
Emptying,
and so it has to do with what it talks about in Philippians 2 in reference to the incarnation.
He emptied himself, allowing them. The emptying of the self means that he was filled with the Spirit, but it was also his own power. So like he never stopped being God. He had access to his own power, but he was limited by
It's just Trinity things,
Just Trinitarian doctrines.
Yeah.
I can nerd out on this stuff all day. I love that doctrine. I mean, really.
Kenosis,
and that, the hypostatic union, which is the union of like fully God, fully man, how that fits together. So between the hypostatic union and the kenosis, like I could just talk for hours, and no one would listen to it.
I accidentally said the word perichoretic in the first service. Like I wasn't planning on saying that, but perichoresis is the Greek word to describe the dance of the Trinity in eternity past. Yeah. And I was talking about how Christians sometimes will look down on people who can't get their act together and how ridiculous that is. Like imagine Jesus, he's in heaven enjoying the perichoretic union that he's enjoyed for all. I was like as it was happening, I was about to say it, I was like, there's no way to go but forward. But
that's hilarious.
But
so back to what you're saying. Different perspectives. So you were focusing. I like that about the woman was the common denominator, but you were focused on the two vantage points and the perspectives from Jesus.
Yeah,
and that, which is really good, because I think most people have Jesus as the perspective. Jesus is the common denominator, and it's the woman's perspective versus the Pharisee's perspective. But you kind of flipped it. You turned it so that the woman was here, and Jesus and the Pharisee had a different perspective.
Right. And the way that set me up to conclude the sermon is I talked about how Jesus, he takes the perspective of grace. So he sees Simon's heart. He confronts the sin in Simon's heart. And not only does Jesus accept the woman because of grace, but he also, and this is my understanding of the text, I believe that Jesus is viewing Simon in terms of grace, because whenever the Spirit is at work in our lives toward conviction, whenever Jesus is confronting us on account of our sin, that is an act of grace. And so Jesus confronts Simon, he calls him out, and I believe that that's also because of this perspective of grace. So then the application is, only when you recognize your need for grace will you be free to love the way that Jesus loves. And so that's kind of my antidote to pride.
What was your closing song?
Oh, Come to the Altar.
Oh, nice.
Because I invited people, come and receive Jesus' grace this morning. I didn't overtly make an altar call, but I encouraged folks to receive the grace of Jesus.
That's awesome. The song I had Gabe learn a new song, which is not a new song, but it's new for him. The song "Forgiven" by Crowder.
Okay, I've not heard. I don't know it.
Let me read to you these lyrics. I think this is so helpful to what we're saying. It says, "I'm the one who held the nail. It was cold between my fingertips. I've hidden in the garden. I've denied you with my very lips. God, I fall down to my knees with a hammer in my hand. You look at me, arms open, forgiven, forgiven. Child, there is freedom from all of it. Say goodbye to every sin, you are forgiven." So then he says, "I've done things I wish I hadn't done. I've seen things I wish I hadn't seen. And just the thought of your amazing grace, and I cry, Jesus, forgive me. God, I fall down to my knees with a hammer in my hand. You look at me, arms open, forgiven, forgiven." And then the bridge is, "I could have been 6 feet under. I could have been lost forever. Yeah, I should be in that fire, but now there's fire inside of me. Here I am, a dead man walking, no grave gonna hold God's people. All the weight of all of our evil, lifted away forever free. Who could believe? Who could believe? Forgiven, forgiven."
Dude, that's amazing.
And it's just such a great reminder of like, that's the perspective.
Yes.
Here's another dance. We're talking about dances. Here's another dance, and I know we hadn't talked about this, but there is a dance of like, hey, stop dwelling on your sin because God has paid for that. Move on. Stop dwelling on that. And, And yet there's an aspect of like, oh, wretched man that I am. Like you need to dwell on how evil you are apart from Christ. So which is it, right?
Yes.
And so this sermon to me was a call to, you are a wretch. You are nothing apart from Christ. And stop thinking you're all that, because apart from Jesus, like, we're the one that held the nail and nailed him in the cross. We're the one that denied him in the garden. We are the one that hid him in the garden. We're the one that denied him at his death. Yeah. Like that's what the song talks about. That's what we've been forgiven from. Like all of the sin in the Bible is all our sin because we're all humans. That's all of our story. And yet there's this tension of like, but that's not who you are. Forget it, right?
Yes.
God forgets our sin from as far as the east is from the west. So which is it, right?
Well, and this is where I think the idea of that Jim talks about all the time of spiritual breathing is very helpful, because it's, like when you hold your breath, you feel the tension of needing to inhale. And so like you just living life, you have to keep breathing. So you need to breathe in God's grace, breathe out the spiritual toxins. And then every time you think, maybe I don't need to breathe. Okay, well then you're going to find out really quickly. Actually, no, you do. It's like right. you depend on God.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this the other day. I was at home just reflecting back on the sermon, and there's this prayer that the Eastern Orthodox Church prays. It's the simplest. It's just called the Jesus prayer. It's the simplest prayer, but they're like the whole Christian faith can be boiled down to this one prayer. It's Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And there's this story about, and I'm pulling way back, dusting off some files in the back of my mind, but there's this one guy who was a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. He just went around and just kept praying this prayer and kept praying this prayer. This was like his life's mission. And that prayer, each word is chiseled and significant. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it just keeps you coming back to who Jesus is.
That's right.
Who we are, what we need, the fact that we need his mercy. It's a beautiful, beautiful. I have a little, when I was in Greece, I bought a prayer mat that has that prayer in Greek. And it sits on my nightstand. And so every morning it's just this reminder, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's the posture of a Christian. And it's, I hammered home at one point in the sermon, 1 Corinthians 6, that such were some of you. Were it not for God's grace, we would be the people that we look down the nose at.
That should be me.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the words in that in that song. But yeah, man, I think it's so important for us, because at the end of the day, and this was another main point in my sermon, not only does, to your point, pride limit your ability to love, but the prideful self-centeredness of Christians produces barriers to people meeting Jesus.
That's right.
Have you heard the quote from Brennan Manning? It's also from a DC Talk song, What If I Stumble? Do you know the song?
I think so. Yeah, I've heard it.
So at the beginning, there's this, they read this quote. It says, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who confess Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That's what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. So that was another huge emphasis in my sermon about how we, like Simon, if it were up to us, we would kick people out. We would produce barriers to people getting to worship at Jesus's feet because of our pride, because they're uncomfortable or whatever it would be. We talked about this a little bit, but I'll pass it back to you. Where do you see pride in, like, cropping up for Christians?
Yeah.
Because, I don't think it's any accident that we find pride in the heart of a religious leader in the New Testament. It's like, in some ways it's to our shame, but a lot of times this pride and this being sort of on the inside of religion or of God's people, these can go hand in hand. So where does this crop up in the church?
That's such a big question to answer, because obviously the root of all sin is ultimately pride. Yeah. And the root of it's all this self-focus, self-centeredness. There's an aspect to, I think, when I think of pride, I think of a couple things. I think when your flesh says to when you hear yourself talking to yourself, because we all talk to ourselves. Wow, this feels good.
I don't know what you mean, Charlie.
Look at me.
Yeah.
They are looking at me, right? And there's a sense of pride. It's interesting, if you Google the word pride, or look up in the Merriam Webster. There is no negative definition of pride.
There's a lot of rainbow definitions.
A lot of rainbow definitions, yes.
Because I did this over the.
But also, there's like a taking satisfaction of something you've accomplished, feeling great worth with who you're associated with, and some of the tasks you've completed. These things that are all inherently good in some level, right?
Yeah, it's true.
And it's interesting because I can be proud of what my son does. Like if my son does well in school, I can be proud of that.
Sure.
If I build something and I'm like, wow, I really feel like I accomplished something. Like, is it wrong for me to have a sense of pride in what I accomplished? Like, wow, I accomplished something. But there's a difference, I think, in the next layer to that, the next step of my worth now becomes associated with that and how others view me or how I view myself.
And what's interesting about that idea of worth is it's really reflective of worship. Mm-hmm. It's like if it's you're noticing yourself to the end of worshiping yourself,
yes,
versus noticing yourself to the end of worshiping God, noticing what's going on with your son to the end of worshiping God. That it's the worship element that determines if it's pride in
Correct.
A sinful sense or not.
Correct.
But
yes.
yeah.
I also think that, it's pretty, like if someone were to be described as a prideful person, I could describe anybody as a prideful person because we all have pride, but someone as a prideful person is somebody who's very, full of themselves, very much like, even if it looks good on the outside, it's all really matters of like what people see, and how what I'm getting, the feedback I'm getting from other people is making me feel good about myself and all these things. And so at face value, it's easy to see, oh, they're a prideful person. They're really caught up in themselves. Like they really think a lot about themselves. But I think also, like you said, who's like what Steve Etner says is who sits on the throne of your heart? Is it King me or God on the throne of your heart? And you have a throne in your heart, and you have to decide who are you worshiping, because we're all created to be worshipers.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's a great question to ask yourself: what takes up most of your brain, your bandwidth, and your thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about?
Yeah,
and that's to me where it really hits home.
Dude,
even if are you thinking about hobbies, what your next adventure is going to be, your next vacation, what you want to do with your day, who you're going to see, and you're going to get this. Like, it's everything focused about your enjoyment, your wants, your desires, what you will for your life.
Yeah, that thing that you're going to buy as soon as you get off of work.
And this is where I struggle with.
Oh
with
yeah,
pride,
dude.
Because I'm a dreamer. I'm a researcher. So like, I'm spending time researching something before I buy it. Like, I just love researching. Like, I'll read every forum back from 2009 about things that are still out there on the internet. I'll read I'll go on Facebook and look at groups. Like, I'm like digging in on stuff before I buy something or research. I'm a hobbies guy. So like, when I press in on those things and that becomes all consuming, yeah, it's at face value, it's innocent stuff, right? It's at a minimum, it's neutral.
Sure.
But what happens is that my time, my thought life, my actions, where I'm spending my money, all is about two letters, M-E, which spells me. It's all about me. Me. What I want, what I desire, what I will, all these things. And it's King me on the throne. And it's not like I'm literally bowing down to myself or like, and at face value, I'm loving people. I'm trying to do these things, but it's like I'm saving this. It's like if I were to have a house, it's like walking to my front door and in the greeting area and the foyer there or whatever, or in the parlor or whatever house you have, that entry area is beautiful. Man, this guy loves the Lord. Like, what a beautiful house and things. But like, it's like all my back rooms are just full of, and all these other spaces in my house are just full of like me. I'm stuffing if my mind is a house, I'm stuffing it full of the things that I want, that I desire. And that, but it's like, but then on face value, yeah, he loves the Lord, and he's, and it's like, but is God asking us not to have hobbies? And is he asking us not to enjoy his creation and not to talk about things like sports? Of course not. That's the balance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a dance and it's a balance that we will always wrestle with forever.
Yeah.
Because we're always going to have pride. That's the number one sin. We're never going to be free of pride because we're human. That's part of it. We're never going to be free of pride until we're in heaven. And it's just the reality. To sin is to be prideful in my mind.
So, for sure. Well, because all back to what we were talking about earlier, all sin is coming out of a place of self-centeredness. But Tim Keller has this quote on idolatry where he says, if there's something that you think about when your mind is undirected, so like just if you're not thinking about anything else, the thing that pops to mind, if there's something that's dominating your thoughts, it's probably an idol.
Well, the interesting thing is, like, I would also say all sin is idolatry.
Yeah.
And like at face value, you might say, how could it be all sin is pride and all sin is idolatry? It's because to me, pride is idolatry.
Yep.
They're the same thing.
Exactly.
It comes down to this, and I think John Piper does the best job of driving this home. We were created for one reason, and that is to bring God glory.
Amen.
And Lou Giglio has a really great talk about worship. And like he'll play different animal sounds and different creatures, and how the rhythm of creation is worshiping God, and how we were created to join in with creation and worshiping the Creator.
Yeah.
And so pride robs us of the ability to worship the Creator. Idolatry becomes where our worship is going. It all comes back to you were created at the purest sense to worship the Creator.
Absolutely.
That is why you were created. That can be done through the relationship we have with God. That comes through the time in the Word. That comes through the salvation, the Spirit's working on our. But like boiling it down to the purest sense, we were created for God's glory and God's glory alone. That simplifies it, but also makes it very profound at the same time. It's like complicates it, but simplifies it at the same time. So.
And at the end of the day, that's kind of where both of us were at in the text. Is Simon fails to see how that his role is not to be self-referential and self-promoting, but he ought to be down there at the feet of Jesus next to this woman.
Yeah.
And
that's the Pharisees. That's the Pharisee tension, right?
Yeah.
The Pharisees had so many rules, over 600 rules added to the law that they followed.
And on that note, we've got about 10 minutes left here, and I do want to ask one final question that's sort of a softball question, but it'll lead us into a good discussion. And the question is it possible to understand this text without understanding first century culture? You know, this is it's a good question, because sometimes people will ask this, man, do we really need to do all the study?
Yeah.
Like, do I really need to, or like why? Or sometimes people will put it this way: why can't we just read the Bible?
Yeah.
Like, why can't we just take it at face value and do all that sort of stuff? And to some extent, I think you can, but I think that there's also a richness here.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I think if you were to read the story straight through, you would find things that were like, wow, that's really confusing. But I think Jesus is clear enough that this is one of those texts where you could walk away with like understanding, okay, the woman had a heart posture where she had awe and reverence for God, and the Pharisee was caught up in himself, and we need to be more like the woman. You could walk away from that, but you miss out on so much of the richness, like you said. And so this is an example of a text where, for example, one of the resources I love that I always encourage people is the Moody Bible Commentary.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I thought you were going to say Craig Keener's Bible Backgrounds commentary.
That's a great commentary.
That's so good.
But, have you ever looked at the Moody Bible Commentary? It's also
I haven't.
good. And it's created for the person who isn't necessarily teaching the text, but it's just as a companion with your word, with the word. And I've recommended it for so many people, and it's really great.
That's awesome.
But having a simple resource that doesn't get into like unless you really want to geek out on some of those really, really dense things. Yeah. Like I could recommend, a couple of people like D.A. Carson, for example, and a couple great scholars who you'll read 4 or 5 pages of dense notes on like 3 verses, and you're like, whoa, okay. Okay, that's great. Yeah. But not every commentary is like that. And there are some commentaries that are great companion pieces to getting in the word. And I'm sure that's the Bible Backgrounds Commentary is similar to that.
Well, Craig Keener is like one of the foremost scholars on Luke's writings, both the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Like he's got I was telling you about this commentary the other day. It's like a $300 4-volume commentary that's thousands of pages. Yeah. So he's like,
for sure.
Dude is legit. I actually met him once at ETS. It was so cool. I was like, anyway, we can get into that later. But Yeah, but you're totally right. It's a companion to the text. It's
and so I think having that kind of a tool that is trusted is super helpful, because it just kind of helps add a little bit of color to the text, but also bring out some of the deeper meaning. But I will say this. There is a temptation for preachers to look for the deeper meaning, and they ride that in their text. And I want to give a warning to anyone listening to any of us preach, or any preacher on YouTube or whatever.
Yeah.
Scripture was not intended to, Scripture is sufficient. Let me put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was never intended to be the start of finding what the deeper meaning is.
Right.
It is the deeper meaning.
Yeah. There is a faith tradition that focuses on the deeper meaning or the hidden meaning, and that's called Gnosticism. That's right. That's one of the earliest Christian heresies is all about this hidden knowledge. We're going to transcend the physical, and we're going to get into this spiritual knowledge that's hidden. And
that's right. And so then you're
then
you're reading between the lines of Scripture to try to find the real meaning.
Right. And Christianity, on the other hand, is about revelation. It's about perspicuity, which is another word for clarity. Mm-hmm. And I love how you said in your sermon, even though there's all these details going on, Luke includes the details that are most important.
That's right.
I said that verbatim. Yep. Another line that I stole from you, unattributed.
What did you say?
I said verbatim. I said even though as we're trying to get into this, it can get a little confusing. We got lots of questions. Luke includes the details that are necessary for us to understand the point of the text.
That's the point, and that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the four Gospels, is that they're four vantage points.
Yeah, and
so they don't contradict each other, but they share or show different things, because that is what they felt was important to include.
Exactly.
And what was important in driving the story of the text from their perspective. It's not wrong.
Right.
Right. And so there's some beauty in saying this is what he included. He could have given more specifics, but he didn't.
Right.
Make things more specific. So we are just going to,
And the other, there's two sides to this coin, because the other side of the coin is that he included details that would have touched on shared assumptions that he had with a first century audience.
Because this is written to a first century audience.
So, for example, we could write the word, Charlie scored a touchdown. Mm-hmm. Well, in 2,000 years, the game of football may be lost to time. They may not understand what a touchdown is. We all know what I'm talking about, because we've got the shared cultural artifact of football. But if an alien came and they had no idea about football and they read about a touchdown and they knew the English language, they'd be like, what Clay is saying is that Charlie was so humble that he was leaning down to the ground and touching down onto the earth to really, it's like, well, that's not at all what a touchdown is.
Exactly. So, this was amplified when I preached in an African church with a translator.
Oh man.
The missionary told me, he said, listen, no figures of speech. Do not use a single figure of speech, because they will not understand it.
That's so funny.
How many times we use figures of speech?
Oh, mm-hmm.
Literally every other sentence.
Constantly.
We use a figure of speech.
Yep.
And I had to so I picked a passage that was about agriculture, and I think you're the vine, we are the branches, kind of a thing.
Sure. John 15.
I think is where I went. I'm trying to remember, or some of the pruning passages from John.
Also, John 15. Yeah.
And I used the story of growing up in an orchard and things, because they're a very agrarian society in Africa. So that landed, but there were a number of times when I would have to normally, what would I normally say here,
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me, man.
And this is why we, as pastors, we do the work of cultural background studies, because we want to share those assumptions with the author.
Yeah.
And so, and this is something that we probably don't have time to get all the way into, because we'll wrap up in just a minute here. But, the dinner, the perfume, the touching feet, not touching feet, the all these sort of faux pas or Yeah, I understand it. I understand them to be more than faux pas that Simon is committing, where he's insulting Jesus by withholding the things that a host ought to have given. Was there one thing that you learned about those cultural elements that was like, oh man, that's so interesting? Like, was there one thing that stood out to you as you were doing your study? Because we don't have time to get into all of them, but if there was a standout, I had a couple standouts.
Go ahead, give it to us.
So the first thing is, I never could figure out, how did this woman get into Simon's house? Like, what is, why are, and I read in several commentaries how, I had always understood this just as a dinner, just like, hey, you're going to eat somewhere tonight. Why don't you come eat with me, type of deal.
Yeah.
But I read that the language that Luke uses when he talks about reclining at table was language used to describe a special occasion. So it was more of a formal banquet.
Yeah.
And I talked about this in the sermon, where it would be open up to the townsfolk to come in and listen to a conversation between the local intellectuals and a traveling teacher, which we know it was Jesus's practice to go around and teach in the synagogues.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Luke doesn't tell us specifically how this story relates to the former story. He just sort of plops this account in here. I think it's possibly because it illustrates the point of Luke 7:30, which is that the Pharisees reject Jesus, and in so doing, they reject God's purposes for them. So I think this story may or may not have chronologically followed what we just read. It may, or it may not, because we know Luke arranged his gospel according to principle, not always according to time. And so, there's all these questions about the context, but I believe Jesus probably came into town, taught, and then got invited to this banquet by this Pharisee where people would have been around. And that's I believe how the woman gets in, because it's either an open air setting or like in a courtyard, because that was also common in those days, or it was just open to the public. And then she still courageously gives this display of affection that we'll talk about on Sunday, but that opened up the text a lot for me. And the second detail that I didn't mention in the sermon was, there's this line in this background commentary I was reading that said, for a guest to comment about the lack of courtesy and hospitality in the host is unknown in fact or fiction. That was the quote. And it's this quote that talks about how, like, for Jesus to address Simon's lack of courtesy would have been explosive in first century culture. Because as much as there were these expectations on the host, it was totally inappropriate to comment on the lack of hospitality. Because the expectation is they are bringing their very best forward. And even if they're not, even if it's lacking, even if you don't like the coffee, you don't like the smell, whatever it is, you would never in a million years comment on it. And yet Jesus totally sidesteps and calls Simon out. And
in front of everybody.
Yeah. And I didn't get into that at all, but I was just like, oh man,
that's so good.
That's so I could have gotten into that. I just didn't have the time in the sermon. But Jesus confronts him when that would have been a scandal. And like in all ancient literature, there's no, according to this source, there's no mention of anyone ever insulting a host. And yet here you have it in the words of Jesus of Nazareth. It's epic.
That's so good, man.
Anyhow, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I mean, no. I think that's good. It was interesting. One thing that's interesting, kind of related, but is the sinful woman. And Jim's going to get into this more, but it's fascinating to me that she was known as that. Why? How? Yeah. And what kind of sin? Right. We can assume if he was known as sinful, it must have been a sin that was pretty. Word had gotten out. It was a public type of sin, maybe prostitution. We don't know. But it's so fascinating to me that a woman who lives a sinful life, or sinful woman, depending on the translation, it's so interesting that it was just like commonly understood. That's who she was by everyone in the room.
Right.
And there's so much behind that. So fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And some like pieces of like the religious leaders would have distanced themselves because if they would have been found labeled unclean if they had associated with them.
Exactly.
The touching of a woman. That's another piece that's a part of the thing that I had dug in. Like the act of touching from an unclean woman would have potentially rendered the rabbi or the religious leaders being unclean.
Yes.
And so in a sense of like, I'm separating myself from sin means I'm also separating myself from the sinners, because if I associate, I'm guilty by association.
Exactly.
And it was why the Pharisees were actually so popular. The Pharisees were a minority. I learned this in my study. They were actually a minority in the Sanhedrin.
Yep.
But they were
the Sadducees were more popular because they were more sympathetic to the Greeks. But yeah.
But the Pharisees actually, this is interesting. The Pharisees actually had a lot of influence, and they had popularity among the lower class.
The Pharisees did.
Mm-hmm. This one perspective, because
interesting.
Because they set themselves up as being such a high standard that everyone wanted to be that standard.
Huh.
And so it was not a like we like them. Was we want to be like them. And so that's why they had so much influence, because everyone wanted to be like the Pharisees, because they arrived. They had arrived.
Yeah, they've got the Tesla. They're driving around and
yes.
Man.
Maybe someday I can be as holy as the Pharisees, which is why you'll often see the Pharisees being in crowds of people. You'll see poor people around the Pharisees because it was almost like they became like a pseudo Christ. If I could just touch their cloak, maybe I could be like them. If I could just be around them, maybe I could become like someday arrived like them. It's like, it's so interesting, right?
But then the tragedy is obviously that they cast out the people who were most in need of God's people to receive them.
But then again, people would receive that because, you're right. Thanks for the reminder. You are so good and amazing, and I am so lowly. And but it was still like, but I just want to be like you.
Yeah.
Because that's how we are as humans. Mm-hmm. And so that's the interesting thing about the Pharisees that I uncovered, was that like, it wasn't like they were this outcast group that no one wanted to be like. No, they were like
dude.
There was something about them that people were like, wow, right? And we see that even today. There's a reason why there's a certain attraction to those people that seem like they've arrived spiritually.
Yeah.
Even if it's through legalism. That caters, because legalism brings control, and we want to control our lives. Mm-hmm. And so there's a reason why that appeals to some people, is all I'm saying, is because it provides control. But I know we don't want to get into that. So look, I had nothing, and there it is, a big thing. But we should probably wrap up.
Any closing thoughts?
I'm excited for round 2.
Yeah, dude.
With digging into the woman, but it was a good gut check for me. I told Rachel as soon as I was digging in halfway through the week, I'm like, oh, Rach, this is convicting me so much. I had some people in my mind that I had not been loving well.
Yeah.
And
for me, it was absolutely this reminder that the ground before the foot of the cross is a level ground.
That's right.
And there's this quote, I think I used it in one service, but not both. The gospel is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. I think that's another Brennan Manning quote, but just this reminder that I am just as in need of God's grace as the next person. Right. And so, shame on me, shame on us when we fail to remember that. And we need to constantly call that to mind. So I love our church because I think we do a great job at welcoming people in. I said this during, I wanted to encourage people because it was a pretty heavy sermon. I told people, I think we do a good job, but we always need to be vigilant. Yeah. And so that's kind of my takeaway from this text is how can we be vigilant against pride toward welcoming people in to belong to Christ in and to us. So
that's good.
Man, great conversation, Charlie. Thanks for joining me, man.
Good stuff, man.
And thank you for making it to the end of this episode. Man, we love getting to have these conversations. If you're enjoying them, go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, give us a 5-star review, do all the YouTube podcast things, because that helps us to know that you're being ministered to by these conversations as we're opening up the word, picking up the pieces that get cut out from each week of the sermon, because God's word is awesome. There's plenty for us to learn from it. So excited for next week. And until then, we'll sign off. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast.
But don't let the conversation end here. Find a group where you can deepen your roots at connect.opendoor.tv. And don't forget to submit your questions to podcast@opendoor.tv. Have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.